the volcano has blown itself out of existence.
As well as being a spectacular volcanic eruption, Krakatoa is important for other reasons. Just before the eruption, undersea telegraph cables had been laid between Jakarta and the rest of the world. So as the eruption unfolded, people could follow it in real time, the same way that we would do today using the internet. So in that sense, Krakatoa became the world's first globally reported disaster story.
The Dutch geologist Roger Verbeek also played a critical role in raising Krakatoa to its iconic status.
After the eruption, his report was so insightful that it laid the foundations for an entire new science, volcanology. And it's for these reasons that Krakatoa is one of the top 10 natural disasters of all time.
On August the 24th, 2005, a tropical storm forms over the Bahamas. 5 days later, it will leave the city of New Orleans in ruins.
Everything was gone within a flickering of an eye.
A chain of natural events and human error will conspire to make Katrina the world's most expensive hurricane.
It's just all gone.
It's for these reasons meteorologist Tim Marshall thinks this disaster should be in the top 10.
New Orleans is a city surrounded by water. 300 years ago, it was just a small settlement on the bank of the Mississippi River, high above sea level. But over time, it's expanded out into marshlands, and people now live below sea level in much of New Orleans.
With large sections of the city below the waterline, people here are particularly vulnerable to hurricanes. Because it's not just the high winds that make these weather systems so dangerous, but the body of water that's pushed before them, known as a storm surge. Many hurricane deaths are the result of drowning. On the 24th of August 2005, the National Hurricane Center is tracking the tropical storm that will become Katrina.
Katrina first formed, it was nothing really unusual. It was pretty much like any other tropical system at that point.
The storm soon intensifies to a Category 1 hurricane.
So our demeanor at that point was to treat it like a normal hurricane that we've seen many times before.
Like all hurricanes, Katrina forms as rising warm air from the sea creates strong winds and thick clouds full of moisture. Fueled by the unusually warm seas of the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina quickly grows into a much bigger and more powerful hurricane. Back at the weather center, Katrina looms large on the screens.
The satellite imagery revealed a huge eye. It became apparent that we were dealing with a Category 5 hurricane at this point.
The data shows Katrina will strike New Orleans in less than 24 hours.
We had to start issuing our watches and warnings and statements.
Every person is hereby ordered to immediately evacuate.
Those that can get out of town. 1 million people flee the city. But many people simply can't afford to leave. Stanley and Betty Stewart live in the lower 9th Ward.
The decision was made that we weren't going to be able to go anywhere under the financial conditions, and we elect to just stay and pray and hope for the best.
So it ended up being 13 of us in the 2 rooms, basically. All of us know we hunker down.
Up to 100,000 people are left behind to face whatever nature has to throw at them.
We padded our back door with some towels to just keep the water from actually seeping under.
With a long history of hurricane strikes, New Orleans is surrounded by 560 kilometers of protective levees.
A levee is just made of combinations of clay and sand. The big problem came with all of these miles of levee, that some levees were high and some levees were low, some were sinking.
Worse still, the levees were not built to withstand a hurricane of Katrina's intensity. The 29th of August, 6:10 a.m. Hurricane Katrina strikes land with wind speeds of 210 kilometers per hour. With waves up to 8 meters high, the largest storm surge in American history pummels the Gulf Coast. New Orleans is inundated with water.
You can actually hear the waves coming over the roof of the home.
Those stranded have little idea what to do.
Don't panic. Keep these children down.
My brother, looked at me. I said, man, we just really need to pray. I say, because visually it actually looked like it was going to be your last day on earth.
2 p.m. and the residents of the lower 9th Ward are in serious trouble.
We got major flooding here. Lots of problems here, lots of problems.
Some people were actually by that time in 20 feet of water. Some of our friends that were in homes, they had loss of life.
The 30th of August. The hurricane has blown itself out. All the main communication lines are down.
Just trying to figure out, are we the only people left, or is there anybody else around?
With most of New Orleans underwater, the emergency services are left floundering.
They finally said on the radio, you've got to realize that the levee on the 17th Street Canal broke and there's water to the roofs of the houses in Lakeview. I can tell you my life changed right at that point. Everybody didn't realize that this was a new ball game now, that now the city was flooding.
Chris and his colleagues face a disaster of epic proportions.
Everywhere you went, you saw bodies floating. They didn't have enough coroners to come pick up the bodies.
The survivors are corralled into the New Orleans Superdome and Convention Center.
The conditions that was at the convention center was unbearable. People were thinking that they were going to go to a lit shelter where maybe there would have been food or clothing or water. It was nothing. And people were literally just abandoned out on the streets.
With over 46,000 people, some are left with little option but to fend for themselves.
People were dying for lack of resources. We were like, oh my goodness, is this the end of the earth? Is this the end of life?
The failure by the authorities to deal with the rescue and evacuation of so many compounds the disaster.
The big thing that caught people off guard was the flood waters. Nobody expected 80% of the city to be underwater.
Almost a decade later, 1 in 5 of the population still hasn't returned. And large sections of the city lie in ruins.
I'm currently driving through the lower 9th Ward here, one of the areas that was hardest hit from Hurricane Katrina. And most of the houses here, people didn't come back to. They just abandoned them or just left them here to rot. And it's sort of sad because a neighborhood is gone. It's going to take a generation or more to rebuild this area.
2 weeks after Katrina swamped New Orleans, President George Bush apologizes for the administration's failure to deal with the aftermath.
Katrina exposed serious problems in our response capability at all levels of government. And to the extent that the federal government didn't fully do its job right, I take responsibility.
The impact of human error is why Tim Marshall places this disaster in the top 10.
Certainly, Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster, but that natural disaster was compounded by the effects of man. The fact that Katrina happened was a wake-up call. Now, the levees are built a little higher, maybe a little stronger. But this disaster can happen. In fact, it will happen again.
This is how the Earth looked at the end of the last ice age. The northern hemisphere covered in ice. Europe barely recognizable. But evidence suggests the world map is about to be redrawn by a mega flood of biblical proportions. Oceanographer Simon Boxall is fascinated by the idea of a planet-changing flood and has nominated it for the top 10. This disaster begins around 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. A huge glacier covering an area we now know as Canada is receding. As it melts, a vast freshwater lake, bigger than Texas, forms. For a time, the water is contained behind a wall of ice. But 8,500 years ago, this ice gives way, releasing this colossal body of water into the world's oceans.
This had a dramatic impact on the already rising sea levels, adding a further 1 to 2 meters, that's 3 to 6 feet in a very short period of time. And if that was to happen today with the same speed, it would completely devastate London, New York. In fact, it would impact on every coastal nation around the world.
And in the ancient world, the rising waters spreading across the planet could have also led to disaster. Because according to some studies, the area now covered by the Black Sea was once home to one of the largest populations of the time.
9,000 years ago, this would have been an enormous valley leading down to this huge freshwater lake. It would have been filled with settlements, farmlands, a population of over 100,000 people. But that all changed when the floodwaters hit.
Swollen by the mega flood, water from the Mediterranean begins to pour into the region, transforming the once fertile land into a saltwater sea. Simon Boxall meets Konstantin Cherev, who in 2011 took part in a survey of the Black Sea that produced an astonishing find.
When we scanned the seabed, we found a formation that's really unusual. It was sort of a round hill, and that's not very common for the Black Sea. So we decided to send a probe and take a sample of it.
As they carefully inspected the core sample, the scientists made an unexpected discovery. Tiny pieces of wood.
This is the top. When we analyzed the wood and carbon dated it, we found that it's 9,000 years old, and that's amazing.
Where do you think it came from?
The most exciting scenario is that this underwater hill is actually an ancient human settlement, because as a shape and size and height, it exactly matches the settlements on the ground we found all over Eastern Europe.
Cherev is certain an area that's now under 90 meters of water was once dry land.
Absolutely. I'm 100% positive about it.
To find out more about the people that were living in the region hit by the flood, Simon Boxhall has been given rare access to examine an incredible archaeological find. Unearthed from a nearby burial site dating back over 6,000 years were over 200 skeletons, along with a spectacular treasure trove of gold. Expert Hristo Smolenov believes this precisely made jewelry is proof of a surprisingly advanced civilization.
For instance, those are two separate gold objects, quite different, and still they fit perfectly. And this is more than you can expect from a culture 7,000 years old. It is a superculture.
It's amazing how precise their measurements were in a culture that is so ancient.
Hristo has little doubt this superculture was living right in the megaflood's path. And he believes the exodus of these people played a crucial role in the development of Western civilization.
I think the migration of this superculture that followed some of the catastrophic events that took place here is responsible for the migration of knowledge as well.
If Smolenov is correct, it is possible that the scattering of this ancient population may have sowed the seeds from which the Egyptian and Greek cultures eventually grew 2,000 years later. Simon Boxhall is also convinced of the profound effect this mega flood had on humanity.
This flood drove apart a burgeoning civilization, possibly one of the earliest we know. And yet, this flood could have been the catalyst that led to our modern civilization. And it's for this reason that I believe that this ancient flood deserves its place amongst the world's top 10 natural disasters.
In 1906, San Francisco is the biggest and most powerful city on America's west coast. But what none of its inhabitants know is they're living over a ticking time bomb. That's all about to change when a massive quake strikes. Seismologist Thomas Jordan has selected this earth-shattering event for the top 10 because of the way it helped unlock the inner secrets of our planet and revolutionized our understanding of how we can protect ourselves from these deadly forces. Modern-day San Francisco. Its famous switchback streets provide clues to just how geologically active the area is.
The hills here in San Francisco and around the San Francisco Bay remind us that the forces that caused them are the same as those that caused the 1906 earthquake. At the time, of course, people didn't understand that this beautiful topography was related to earthquakes. That would become very evident on April 18th, 1906.
On the night of April the 17th, the famed tenor Enrico Caruso performs at the San Francisco Opera House. But in just a few hours, this proud city will be turned into a disaster zone.
At 5 in the morning, things were pretty quiet. But suddenly at 5:12, the earthquake hit.
An earthquake with a magnitude of 7.8 shakes the city. Roads rip apart and people panic.
People realized it was an earthquake, but very few understood where the earthquake might be coming from and what might happen next.
Buildings never designed to withstand earthquakes crumble.
The City Hall was the biggest building west of the Mississippi River. It took humans 25 years to build it. It took the earthquake 2 minutes to destroy it.
it's not just the collapse of their homes the residents have to deal with. The tremors crack gas pipes. All it takes is one flame to ignite the fumes. In just a few hours, an inferno engulfs San Francisco.
There were probably 50 fires that began in this part of San Francisco, and they eventually coalesced into a massive firestorm that consumed on the first day all of the central business district down along Market Street. Those flames then spread on the second and third day to the west and north up to Fisherman's Wharf. During those 3 days, the city was almost completely destroyed by fire.
After 3 days, the fires burn themselves out to leave a scene of utter annihilation. 80% of the city is in ruins. But it's what happens next that makes the 1906 earthquake one of the top 10 disasters.
3 days after the 1906 earthquake, before the fires of San Francisco had stopped burning, George Pardee, the governor of California, appointed a special commission to study the earthquake and learn from what had happened.
It falls to Professor Andrew Lawson and his team from Berkeley University to conduct the first comprehensive survey of an earthquake.
The Lawson Report in 2 volumes represents a most incredible breakthrough in our understanding of how earthquakes work.
At the time, people thought the fault line that runs near San Francisco was caused by the quake. But Lawson's report confirmed it was the other way around. And he named the culprit behind the 1906 disaster the San Andreas Fault. It's a revelation that's helped geologists like Alan Lester to better understand the mechanics of earthquakes.
The disastrous 1906 earthquake turned out to be a huge learning point for geologists regarding how big faults like the San Andreas move. Strike-slip faults like the San Andreas have the capacity to build up huge amounts of strain and stress within the earth. It's very much like taking a stick and pushing on it, building and building the deformation in the stick, and if that force, if that stress is released, it comes right back. It's elastic. But there is a point where if you push a little too hard, it breaks. That's exactly what happened in 1906, and with most of the major earthquakes that have occurred along the San Andreas, a point has been reached where the earth can no longer take the strain that's been building, and it breaks.
Thanks to the Lawson Report, we can now identify high-risk earthquake zones and engineer buildings to protect the people living in them. For Thomas Jordan, this ability to better cope with the dangers from earthquakes can be traced back to the birth of modern seismology.
From my personal point of view, the 1906 earthquake is the most important earthquake because we learned for the first time important facts about how earthquakes occur, and with that knowledge, we hope to be able to avoid the kinds of destruction that San Francisco saw in that terrible day.
The 7th of June, 1783. For weeks, rumbling from deep inside the earth has disturbed the peace of the Icelandic countryside. Within 24 hours, it will be ripped apart and transformed into a fiery hell on earth. It's the start of a toxic cataclysm that will engulf the Northern Hemisphere, claiming countless victims from Europe to Asia. Although this disaster is relatively unknown, volcanologist Thor Thordarson rates it as the deadliest volcanic eruption ever, earning it its place in the top 10. Sitting directly on top of the mid-Atlantic ridge, where two vast plates are pulling away from each other, Iceland is one of the most volcanic places on Earth. In 1783, the plates are particularly restless. As they lurch violently apart, a 30-kilometer crack in the Earth's surface, known as the Larky Fissure, rips open. Along its length, 130 bubbling craters spew out billions of tons of molten rock, and will continue to do so for 8 fiery months.
It is the largest eruption on Earth in the last 500 years. That makes Larky one of the greatest eruptions in history.
As Larky erupts, over 40 billion tons of lava spill out of the fissure, enough to engulf a city the size of Chicago. Normally, when lava is exposed to air, it cools and solidifies, which limits how far it can travel. But the lava from Larky was able to travel for hundreds of kilometers, thanks to an underground system. Led by local guide Bjorn Hjorsen, Thor explores the remnants of this subterranean network, known as lava tubes. The caves are created when the upper layers of lava form a crust, protecting the free-flowing molten rock below from the cold air.
Look at that level of the lava river right there. And up here, part of the roof is remelting, and you can even see these nice little droplets coming down. This shows how hot this environment was at the time, how hot the lava is, how hot the gas is right above the lava, because to form this, the temperature needs to be at 1100 degrees C. These are the key to making long lava flows. When you transport the lava through these kind of systems, it just stays fluid and hot all the way down until it breaks out of the transport system.
Traveling through the tubes, Larky's lava spreads over 60 kilometers before eventually resurfacing. In total, the molten rock razes 20 villages to the ground. Larky also hurls out millions of tons of ash and toxic gases, poisoning the soil and crops. 3/4 of Iceland's sheep and more than half of all its livestock die. The people soon follow.
Because of starvation and other diseases, about 21% of the Icelandic population perished as a consequence of the Larky eruption.
But the Larky eruption is to have an even more disastrous effect on the rest of the world. Although remote, Icelandic volcanoes can have far-reaching consequences, as recent events prove. The cloud from Larky engulfs a vast part of the northern hemisphere and carries with it something far more deadly than just ash.
A total of 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide were emitted into the atmosphere, where it reacted with atmospheric vapor to produce sulfuric aerosols.
These aerosols block the sun's heat, causing global temperatures to plummet. In Europe, the cold causes intolerable food shortages. Some experts believe these drove hungry peasants in France to rise up, eventually leading to the French Revolution of 1789. Across the Atlantic, temperatures also dropped dramatically.
On the eastward of North America, the winter 1783-84 is the longest and the most severe on record. In my view, makes it one of the most important natural disasters of all times.